Hey guys, this is for seniors, government. Remember to check out the last video if you haven't, or any video that you haven't checked out. Really try to stick to like watching these videos on your asynchronous days. I know it sounded like a broken record, but it's like really important that you do that. Otherwise, it'll be really hard to follow along. And you are responsible for all the material from in person, well, not in person, but from live class and these videos. So please make sure you watch these from start to finish. Okay, so we've been talking about the Supreme Court for most of this week, and today, well, in this video, we're going to talk about the interactions that the judicial branch has with the other two branches, with the executive and legislative branches. It's more than you might think. We know the president appoints the federal judges, but like the whole appointment process is more complex than that. More than I had even realized, to be honest. So we're going to explain. I'm going to explain that to you, as well as talk about confirmation and all of that. Now, we know the president appoints all the federal judges. So not only the Supreme Court, but he appoints judges from the Court of to all the Court of Appeals and to all the federal district judgeships. So that's over 800 judgeships. Now, they're appointed by the president. Remember, Donald Trump has had an enormous amount of success getting judges confirmed. He's appointed over 200 judges, largely because the Senate has been Republican, and Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader of the Senate, has prioritized judicial confirmations. So Trump has been very successful in only one term of actually filling the courts with a lot of his judges. But the process is a little bit more complex. I know the president just appoints who he wants. Federal judges tend to be from the area in which they are appointed. So, for example, a federal district judge appointed for South Dakota or Newark, New Jersey, or Atlanta, they tend to be from that area. So it's not like you're going to pluck a judge from Indiana and put him in Tennessee. So they tend to be from the area where they're appointed. Now, most people who are appointed to federal judgeships are prominent law professors, state judges, who received who have a good reputation, successful private attorneys. Some people distinguish themselves either as prosecutors or as, every once in a while, defense lawyers. Usually not for Republican appointees, but Democratic appointees sometimes had been criminal defense attorneys. So they generally have a large range of experience in terms of dealing with the law, in different areas of the law. Now, the executive branch, the president and his people, usually consult with senators from the state where the vacancy occurs. So, if there's a vacancy in the district court for Iowa, the president and the president's people usually consult with the two senators from Iowa regarding who should be appointed to that seat. Now, the reason why that's significant is, like, let's give a hypothetical. Joe Biden, he's a Democrat. There's a federal judgeship in Iowa that gets vacant. Iowa has two Republican senators, Chuck Grassley, Joni Ernst. So the thing is that the president, with Joe Biden, a Democrat, would consult with the two Republican senators from Iowa in order to determine who to appoint to that vacant judicial position in Iowa. Now, this does, at least theoretically, lead to bipartisan cooperation. That Democratic presidents have to cooperate with Republican senators or vice versa, but not always. Sometimes, especially in the last few years of the Obama administration, Republican senators refused to consult with Obama at all and come up with any judicial appointments that Obama could make. The idea is to come up with judges who are acceptable to both sides. So if it's a Democratic president or Republican and Republican senators in that state, hopefully they would come up with a moderate judge who would be okay with the Democrats and okay with the conservatives. At least in theory. Well, I don't know how Biden is going to work this process, but he's kind of an institutionalist, and this is the way it's always been done. So like except for the Trump years. So I'd assume he probably want to go back to this. So it ensures the that less ideological judges are appointed this way, right? So if there's president of one party and senators from another party, then you're probably not going to get very liberal or very conservative judges appointed to the courts. Now, judges sometimes surprise the president with their ideology. You could actually, a Democratic president could, well, it usually happens the other way, but a Republican president could appoint someone to the court and the Supreme Court, the lower courts, thinking that they're a conservative, but when they go in the court, their philosophy sometimes is different than the president expected. It happens Well, not often, but happens often enough that a Republican appointee actually does not issue solidly conservative rulings all the time. It's unusual for the other to happen, like liberal, like a Democrat appointee actually issuing conservative decisions. But some people would explain that by saying that, well, when you're actually in a position of responsibility as a federal judge, and you really take your responsibility seriously of being neutral and not bringing your own thinking necessarily into decision making, and when you actually in a position to actually help set precedent, then often ideology takes a back seat. Also, you're there for life, so you don't have to worry about pleasing conservatives. So sometimes, if you're a Republican appointee, so often the responsibility of being a federal judge leads newly appointed judges to actually veer from the ideological point of view that you might think that they might have going in. Now, when a federal judge is appointed, the Senate Judiciary Committee actually holds hearings on judicial appointments. Now, often when the hearings are conducted, judges almost never will actually get appointments, will never get into how you would rule in a specific case or how you feel about abortion or things like that. They usually don't answer questions like that, and they're usually not asked questions like that. But sometimes senators do ask questions to kind of get a clue about like where the appointee, the prospective judge might stand on an issue, like what's your position on X case, how do you feel about this previous precedent. They try to ask questions that kind of get to what your judicial philosophy might be without directly asking you what your judicial philosophy is. They get these litmus test questions, they call them, to gauge a prospective judge's philosophy. Now, senatorial courtesy is a procedure that's been in place, again, really until the Trump years, where home state senators are really in the driver's seat in terms of recommending judges to the president. So, again, a judicial appointment comes up in Nebraska. The senators in Nebraska would usually work with the president coming up with an acceptable judge. This tradition of senatorial courtesy is called the blue slip tradition. Now, what that means is, like, say the president, we'll keep picking on Nebraska. Say the president appoints a judge, President Biden appoints a judge for Nebraska, for the Nebraska District Court. Now, in order for that person to get a hearing, what traditionally has happened is both senators from Nebraska would have to submit literally a blue slip saying that this person is acceptable to me. We can hold hearings on this person. If one of the two senators or both senators refuse to submit this blue slip, the tradition dictates that that appointment does not go forward, that the president does not go forward with that appointment. So that gives senators almost a veto power over who the president appoints. Traditionally, this wasn't abused to the way it has been in recent years. Usually, senators, even if the senators are Republican, the president's a Democrat, usually they can come up with something, and a Republican senator won't actually sabotage an appointment a president made. Maybe they'll vote him down, but maybe they'll vote against him, but like they won't actually not submit their blue slip. Because the idea is the president has the right to make these appointments. But during the Obama years, it got so crazy that anybody Obama appointed to a federal judgeship, if that state had a Republican senator, they refused to submit the blue slip, like almost as a policy. Not like, oh, sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. Republican senators just were not submitting blue slips at all. So Obama was unable to actually make a lot of appointments. I remember I heard Sean Hannity say, oh, how did Obama leave so many vacancies for Trump to fill? Well, he didn't. It was because the senators refused to submit, Republican senators refused to submit the blue slip. So the tradition dictated that that person does not actually get nominated. So the judicial spot remains vacant. Under Trump and the Republican Senate, they have abandoned the blue slip tradition. Meaning, if Trump appointed a judge for, say, New Jersey has two Democratic senators, right? Say those senators, one of those senators, or both of those senators, Menendez or Cory Booker, would not submit the blue slip. They didn't care. They just held hearings on that person and voted for that person anyway. So the Republicans kind of abandoned the blue slip tradition after having abused it during the Obama years. So that's another norm That's actually been eroded in the past few years. So the question became, which might be moot if the Republicans keep control of the Senate, but the question was, excuse me, whether a senator, whether they would, if the Democrats retain control of the Senate, will they bring back the blue slip tradition, which would allow Republican senators to potentially veto Democratic appointees? Personally, I do not think that's a good idea. Because then they'll just do the same thing to Biden as they did to Obama, right? They'll just block all the appointments. But I don't know. We'll see what happens. It all depends on the Georgia runoffs in January to see if the Democrats actually control the Senate. Now, in U.S. history, there have been 161 appointments made to the Supreme Court. 11 of those have been rejected, meaning the Senate actually voted those people down, said that we will not uh, confirm these people. There have been about 25 appointments that have actually been withdrawn because the president finds out something about that judge that was bad. I remember one judge, Douglas Ginsburg, who was appointed to the Supreme Court. They found that he had smoked weed when he was in law school. They withdrew the appointment, just showing how times change, right? I do not think that would be grounds. That was back in '88. I don't think that would be grounds to withdraw a nomination today. So sometimes they find out about something about the person, or they don't think the person can actually get through the Senate. So to spare everyone the embarrassment, they just withdraw the nomination. So about 25 people have actually been withdrawn, and 11 people have been straight out rejected. Now, we talked a little about this in class, but the American Bar Association actually gives recommendations on whether the judicial appointment is either highly qualified, qualified, or not qualified to be a federal judge. They use criteria like what is their experience with the federal system? Have they actually tried a case? All of that. That system actually has been eroded as well, because the thing is, a lot of conservatives believe that the American Bar Association has a liberal bias, even though they routinely give conservative judges highly recommended, highly qualified ratings. But there's this feeling that they're biased against conservatives. So Trump actually refused to even list an administration, refused. They didn't even care what the American Bar Association's recommendations were for judicial appointments. Now, liberal interest groups and conservative interest groups mobilize anytime there's a Supreme Court appointment, big time, because they know if this person is going to be there for life, is going to have an enormous effect on American law. They wage sometimes advertising campaign to the public. They wage an aggressive lobbying campaign on senators to try to either vote this person down or to approve this person. So a Supreme Court appointment, a Supreme Court vacancy is usually time for like full-scale mobilization. That didn't happen that much this year when Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away, because it all happened so quickly, right? Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away, then the next week when Trump held the super spreader event announcing Amy Coney Barrett's appointment, a whole bunch of people got COVID after that maskless event. And then the hearings were a couple weeks later, and then they confirmed her a couple weeks after that, before the election. So it all happened so quickly. So there wasn't the usual mobilization campaign that often happens, when a Supreme Court appointment is made, because again, it was very, very quick. Now, ideology, prospective judge's personal political philosophy has become a key criteria to determine whether somebody will support a Supreme Court judge or not. Whether the person is liberal or conservative, or how liberal and how conservative they are, right? Often they say, well, if the person's conservative, okay, but is the person like aggressively conservative? Are they a conservative judicial activist, or vice versa? Do they have some troubling statement or ruling, regarding a controversial issue, particularly racial things? So they kind of ideology has become a prime consideration for Congress to decide whether they're going to approve Supreme Court appointments. In 1970, Richard Nixon made two very controversial Supreme Court appointments. A man named Clement Haynsworth and another man named Harold Carswell. He appointed to the Supreme Court. They were both Southerners. I think that was a play. I'm pretty sure that was a play that Nixon was making for Southern votes for his reelection. And both of them, Haynsworth had some really troubling rulings in the past in racial issues, particularly opposition to desegregation, things like that. And he was rejected as a Supreme Court justice, as was Harold Carswell, for similar reasons. And he had a very weak record. In fact, one of his defenders actually said, well, there's a lot of mediocre judges. They need representation too. So if that's your defense, then you're in trouble. So that was really, I think, the first time in modern times anyway when ideology has been a prime consideration to reject a Supreme Court judge. Probably the best example though was in 1987. Robert Bork was appointed to the Supreme Court. Now Robert Bork was not just a conservative; he was a radical reactionary, hardcore right winger. Did not think there was a right to privacy in the Constitution. Opposed most of the Warren Court decisions. Very, very right wing. And Bork also had some very, retrograde views on women's rights. So he was very, very conservative. Remember the year before, 1986, we talked about this, Antonin Scalia had been appointed to the court and had been confirmed unanimously, even though he was conservative. So that gives you some idea of just how conservative Bork was. Teddy Kennedy, who was the senator from Massachusetts, a very liberal senator, brother of the late President Kennedy. This is what Kennedy said when Bork was nominated. In Robert Bork's America, it's a land in which women would be forced into back alley abortions, blacks would sit at segregated lunch counters, rogue police could break down citizens' doors in midnight raids, and school children could not be taught evolution. So it was really throwing down the gauntlet there. It was a hardcore ideological statement. And then Bork started going back and forth with the different senators. The head of the chairman of the Judiciary Committee at the time was Joe Biden, and Biden actually was doing a lot of back and forth with Bork, and Bork was willing to engage. And really, tried to defend his positions, but in the process, really exposed just how right wing like he was. And the thing is that liberal interest groups mobilized to try to defeat Bork's appointment to the judge. Bork was also kind of nasty too, like especially like in his in his answers, he kind of came off badly. So if anybody's curious, you can YouTube Bork hearings. The whole thing, Biden played a starring role in that back in 1987. The whole thing was just a mess. And the thing is that ultimately, Robert Bork was rejected for a seat in the Supreme Court. It was 42 votes yes, 58 votes no, and I think 6 Republicans voted to reject Bork. Such was his conservatism. He also had some other troubling things. He had been Solicitor General for Nixon, and he was the one that ultimately fired the Watergate special prosecutor at Nixon's request. So that was a troubling part of his record. He was brilliant, a brilliant judge, but somebody whose views were considered so far outside the mainstream that he just cannot be an objective judge. So conservatives, though, use this incident to kind of say that the liberals now just destroy people's reputations in order to deny them Supreme Court seats just because they're conservative. They actually came up with a whole verb for it: to be borked, meaning a judicial appointment who undergoes character assassination in order to keep them off the court because they're a conservative. It was pretty intense, the campaign against Bork, but there were legitimate reasons to be against Bork based on his ideology. In 1991, only 4 years later, Clarence Thomas was appointed to the Supreme Court to replace Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood Marshall was the first black justice on the court, but a very liberal judge. And Clarence Thomas was black, but his philosophy could not be more different. That's good English. Could not be could not be more different than Thurgood Marshall's. He was an arch conservative, an originalist, someone who believed in strict interpretation of the Constitution. He was also only 43 years old. He had never actually argued a case in federal court. He had only been in the Federal Court of Appeals for a year. So there were plenty of objections to him on the merits. But the thing is that he probably would have gotten through without that much problem. But then a woman named Anita Hill came forward and said that he had sexually harassed her when she worked for him, when he was head of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission in the early 80s. And she gave graphic testimony in which she said Clarence Thomas had routinely harassed her by discussing sex in graphic terms, continually asking her on dates. And the thing is that these hearings, I remember as I was really young, I was about 8 or 9, it got massive coverage. And it was really the first time when sexual harassment was really talked about, in in such a setting. Like, it was not something that was, unfortunately, it was not something that was really discussed, that much. And Anita Hill, she was African American. She was young, and she actually had to face all these senators on the Judiciary Committee who were questioning her, who were all male. There wasn't one woman senator on the committee. I think there were only two women senators in the entire Senate back then. So they were all white males questioning her. Joe Biden, I'll be honest, I don't think handled that very well. They were actually corroborating witnesses who could actually say that, yeah, they remember at the time that Anita Hill was talked about the harassment, and other women who apparently he had harassed. And Joe Biden did not call these witnesses at the request of Republican senators, which was a real fail. In fact, Anita Hill to this day really is angry about the way that she was treated. And she said, I think I read an interview with her a few weeks ago. She said that she would vote for Joe Biden, but she still has some real problems with the way he conducted those hearings. Biden voted against Thomas's nomination. He said he did believe in Anita Hill, but he did give a lot of deference to Republicans on the committee. And Clarence Thomas turned into a racial thing, saying, "Oh, well, he's being attacked just because he's black and because he's conservative." Um, and he ultimately got through, but very narrowly, 52 to 48. He got on the Supreme Court. Um, but like, I don't know if he's ever completely gotten over, the whole Anita Hill situation. One effect that the Anita Hill hearings had is that it led a lot of feminist activists to say we need more women on the Senate. So the next year, it was called the Year of the Woman. 1992, 9 women ran for the United States Senate and 5 won. So that was, one of the effects of the whole Anita Hill situation. But the whole thing was very ugly. Anita Hill just like graphically discussing what she said Clarence Thomas had said to her, talking about, graphically talking about sex. And he denied everything and said like he never did any of this and she's making it up. Um, Now, you used to be able to filibuster all judicial appointments. Remember that 60 vote requirement that pretty much stops the Senate from doing anything? Well, it was used so rarely that the thing is that it really didn't have to be addressed as an issue. But in 2005, Democratic senators were filibustering George Bush's judicial appointments. And the Republicans said, who controlled the Senate, because you could only use the filibuster if you're in the minority, Republicans said, we're going to use the quote nuclear option, meaning we're going to get rid of the filibuster completely. We're going to make judicial appointments need only 51 votes in order to be confirmed instead of 60. The thing is that this was seen as such a big deal that this gang of 14 moderate Democrats and moderate Republicans came up with a compromise where they would keep the filibuster intact, but the Democrats would allow a vote on those appointments that they had been blocking that Bush had made. But during the Obama years, it got to the point where the Republicans were filibustering so many of Obama's judicial appointments, they actually got to the position where they said, well, those judgeships themselves shouldn't exist. So we're gonna filibuster all the appointments to those spots. They weren't even questioning really the judges' qualifications. They were just saying we're gonna filibuster everybody, and we're not going to we these there are too many judges, so we're not gonna confirm these people. They were also been doing that with some other Obama appointments. So Harry Reid, who was the Democratic leader of the Senate, did invoke the nuclear option, where he got rid of the filibuster, meaning you only need 51 senators in order to approve a judicial appointment. Now, personally, I think this was completely appropriate because they literally were blocking everybody, and because they invoked the nuclear option, got rid of the filibuster. Obama actually was able to make 89 more judicial appointments. So it actually did have a big consequence. Critics of the move, though, say, well, he got rid of the filibuster, and that meant that when the Republicans got in power, they could approve all of Trump's judges with just a simple majority, too. Even though I'm pretty sure that Mitch McConnell would have invoked the nuclear option himself to get judicial appointments through if the Democrats hadn't done it first. But remember, democracy, right? If a democracy means a democracy, it's majority rules, and you have to let the chips fall where they may if you believe that. 2016, the whole Merrick Garland situation. Antonin Scalia died in February 2016 when Obama still had almost a year left on his term. he was a conservative Judge Scalia, and they were very concerned, the Republican senators, that a conservative judge would be replaced with a liberal judge. And they actually, one Republican senator named Orrin Hatch, who retired a few years ago, but he was a very prominent Republican from Utah. He actually said, well, if Obama appoints Merrick Garland, who was a centrist judge in the Court of Appeals, then that would be a good appointment. So Obama appointed Merrick Garland to be on the to be a Supreme Court justice. But Mitch McConnell, who's the Republican leader, said, well, it's an election year, so we're not going to even hold hearings on this judicial appointment, because we have to let the whoever the winner of the next presidential election is decide. This was totally unprecedented to actually make a move like this, where basically the Supreme Court seat was held hostage, right? And Donald Trump, it was a bet that Mitch McConnell won, because Donald Trump wound up winning in 2016. And the thing is, he was able to fill that seat with Neil Gorsuch, a conservative judge. So it was such an unbelievably aggressive move, and made all the more hypocritical by the fact that in 2020, this year, Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, and then McConnell held hearings on a replacement, even though it was an election year. In fact, it was only a couple of months from the election. Like, she was confirmed a week away from the election. Scalia died almost 9 months before the election. So blatant hypocrisy, right? But Mitch McConnell was able, using these methods, was able to really transform the Supreme Court, right? Because of his moves. Now, that's why the Supreme Court is now a conservative court, or a solid conservative court. Brett Kavanaugh's hearings in 2018 were also very controversial, because a woman came forward and said that he had tried to rape her when they were young. His response was crazed, almost, like, where he was screaming at senators, I like beer, and it was just unreal. If anything, you could argue that, judicial temperament, right? Is this person really have the temperament to actually be a judge if he goes crazy like this? Acquitting himself with absolutely no dignity at all. He was snarling. It really was unbelievable. But the Republicans, there were also some questions about the fact he'd worked with George Bush and had lied about whether he'd handed over documents that Congress had requested. There were a lot of issues with Brett Kavanaugh. He had actually been part of the Ken Starr investigation, which had investigated Bill Clinton for sex with Monica Lewinsky. Ultimately, he was impeached for that, Clinton. So there's a lot of stuff in Brett Kavanaugh's record that was troubling the Democrats. But the most, of course, was the rape allegation. The woman, Christine Blasey Ford, who accused Kavanaugh of trying to rape her, was called before the Senate to testify. But in many ways, it was pretty much guaranteed that Kavanaugh was going to get in, because these confirmation hearings have gotten so partisan that it became to the point where every Republican voted for every Republican appointee. And it really is the hearings, the confirmation process for the Supreme Court justices is really profoundly different, and some people would argue much worse in recent years, because of the sheer partisanship and tricks played by the Senate in order to get preferred judges through. So we'll see what happens when Joe Biden makes his first Supreme Court pick, and see, and if the Senate's Republican, we'll see how that person is treated. Whether they'll give that person a hearing, and what tactics will be used in the case of that judge. So we'll see. All right, guys, very good. So remember, I hope you watch this video. You must watch these videos from start to finish. And I will have a very nice weekend, and I will see you all on Monday. Peace.